Last week, unfortunately, I had to stop, and therefore I couldn't finish the last plague, which actually was the plan. But so it was unfortunate because we were in a certain flow, and so now I have to put you back into that flow, into the world and the cosmology of ancient Egypt. It has to be pointed out before I forget it that throughout the plagues narrative, not a single Egyptian god is mentioned. This is important. Yet God proclaims in Exodus 12:12 that he will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. That is the goal. We covered some of the major gods that were specifically targeted, such as the sun god Ra-Atum, the head of the great Ennead, the group of 9 gods that were worshipped in Heliopolis in biblical On. For example, we had Ra-Atum, and we had Geb, the earth god, and Nun, the sky goddess, etc. And we talked about the significance of the number 9 in Egyptian cosmology and its connection to the 9 plagues. Early on, during the 3rd plague of lice, or whatever it was, and later the plague of boils, Yahweh disrupted the priestly service by attacking specifically the Khartoumim, the indispensable lector priests, usually translated as magicians, but they were much more. The attack on their bodies rendered them unclean and therefore unfit for sacred space. The attack on the lector priests, by extension, represented an assault on the core of Egyptian religion. When the Khartoumim were no longer able to perform the required daily service to their gods, this is when things change, because Yahweh had cut the lifeline, the connection to the gods. The whole religious system collapsed. Cosmic order. Aliyah? Not Ma'at. Okay, you have to come again next week. Ma'at, cosmic order, had turned into Isfet, into chaos, and all the gods were silent. Of course, we see none of this in the actual narrative. This is why I did this. We miss, if we do not have this background, we miss the depth and the severity of what we are reading. So other than that, it's all just about lice, which is a nuisance, or flies, which is just a nuisance, right? And goes away. But that's not what it is. But to an ancient audience, Yahweh's attacks would have been clear. As far as the Israelites were concerned, they had been living in the system for centuries. And as far as their involvement in the system, the Torah is silent. God is all about getting them out of the system. So the background that I gave you helps us to put meat to those bones, right? Okay. So then I wanted to mention something concerning how involved were they with the worship of other gods. Exodus 13:18. It's from today's parsha. Says, so God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. The Chumash has the children of Israel were armed when they went up from Egypt. The word is based, or the word that is used, let's go from there, is Chamash. That's the verb. The root from which we get Chumash, which means, what does Chumash mean? 5. Yeah, Chumash, like the five books. Okay, Chumash. Okay. So if you have just the root, the chet, the mem, and the shin without nikut, it can be anything, right? It can be chamash, chumash, or whatever. Okay, always remember this. When they start interpreting it, they go from the root. They go from what they see and what it might be. Okay, so chumash on page 367 said, we're armed according to the Midrash. And here again, we have to take anything Midrash with a big grain of salt. The word derives from chomesh, which means a fifth. And it implies that only 1/5 of the Jews left Egypt. That's Midrash, okay? That's has nothing to do with anything. It's just Midrash, okay? The rest, which then would be 4/5, and the vast majority, were not prepared to adopt a new life of God's people. They died during the plague of darkness so that the Egyptians would not see the Jews as well as Egyptians were losing their lives. That's Rashi, Middle Ages, okay? So even in death, they're trying to make the Jews not look too bad, okay? But the idea, of course, this is just a midrash, and I have to emphasize this over and over again, but it hints at the very possibility that a vast number, or a number, let's take the vast out, that a number of Hebrews might have been totally caught up in the Egyptian system, serving Egyptian gods beyond hope, just lost, okay? So now we have to get back in that kind of flow and finish off the 10th and the last plague, so we won't get too far into the parsha today. Okay? And I hope that that's okay with you. Good. Okay, death of the firstborn. Exodus 11, look at the picture first. Okay. Even the dog lost a puppy. Yeah. Oh. It says, your firstborn will die of man and beast. Okay? Always remember that animals, certain animals, like the cow, represented a god. Okay? So this is important too. I don't know if I mentioned that. No, but this comes in here, okay? Okay. Exodus 11, verse 1. And Yahweh said to Moshe, I will bring one more plague. And again, the word is nega, and it would be better like stroke, strike, or blow on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out of here altogether. Surely. So this is emphasis. Surely drive you. There is no word in Hebrew for surely. So if you want to put an emphasis on something, you repeat the word. It's a double. So like you shall surely die, literally is you shall die. You shall double die. Okay? What is important here is the use of the verb, garash. Garash, drive out, is first mentioned in the account of God driving out Adam out of Gan Eden. Okay? So, here, Pharaoh, who is being manipulated by God to do this, is driving God's people back to Eden. Okay, why am I saying this? because everything that is going to come, like God coming down, the building of the tabernacle, which is the first step back to Eden. Okay? So this verse summarizes the main purpose and the ultimate outcome of the final stroke or blow, which is to force Pharaoh's supposedly strong arm to release the Israelites from their bondage. Remember the thing with the strong arm, with the strong hand and the strong arm, over and over and over. This is repeated because Pharaoh was supposed to have the strong arm. But God is moving Pharaoh's strong arm the way he wants it to move. Okay? Okay. Exodus 12, verse 29. And it came to pass at midnight that Yahweh struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the first of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So some background here. Some info on why God did what he did and when he did it. And it came to pass at midnight. Midnight held profound significance in Egyptian mythology, symbolizing the peak of darkness, chaos, and vulnerability, directly opposing the sun god Ra, who personified light and order. Remember we talked about this, that Ra and Apophis were fighting it out at night, and then Ra would win and would rise again the next morning. So there was this daily, or night, not daily, nightly fight, okay? According to ancient Egyptian belief, the night was a battleground between Ra and the forces of darkness, with midnight marking the moment of maximum peril as the sun god's journey through the underworld reached its darkest point. The spiritual context makes the timing of the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, at exactly midnight, especially significant. It was not a random moment, but a deliberate act of God to strike at the heart of Egyptian cosmology, demonstrating his supremacy over Ra and the Egyptian pantheon. The plague occurred precisely when the Egyptians felt most exposed and powerless, turning their great fear, nighttime darkness, into the instrument of divine judgment. And remember, they had just been through the darkness, the 3 days and 3 nights of darkness. Okay? This timing also served as a powerful message. God's power transcended the very fabric of Egyptian belief, fulfilling his promise to liberate Israel at the moment of maximum spiritual and psychological impact. Okay, next. Now we're going to look at some important words. Exodus 3:7. And Yahweh said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry. And the word is tseaka, because of their taskmaster, for I know their sorrows. And verse 9, now therefore behold, the cry, tseaka, of the children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Okay, God hears the cry of his people. He is aware of the suffering, and he will intervene because he is a covenant God. Exodus 11, verse 6. Then there shall be a great cry, tseaka gedula, throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like it before, nor shall be like it again. And 12:30, so Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all the servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. The cry of the Egyptians goes unheard. Their gods are silent, all of them. The story has now come full circle from the cry of the Israelites under the slavery to Egypt and the great cry of the Egyptians under the all-encompassing judgment of the one God. So this word for cry, tze'aka, builds a bracket in the story. But this is also the fulfillment of God's promises to Abram. From Genesis 15, the covenant passage, 13 and 14, then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years, and also the nation whom they serve I will judge. That is the moment. And we find a direct connection between the issues here in the Exodus narrative and the following legislation at Sinai based on this narrative, with a dire warning to the Israelites. Exodus 22, verses 21 through 24. You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry at all at me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. You didn't get 3 colors? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it doesn't matter. You can't see it. Okay. Here we have something that in the Hebrew is there is more forceful. It's more emphasis, because we have the doubles. We have 3 doubles. We have first afflict, which is here in any way. There is no such word in any way. It's afflict. It's a double afflict. You see the yellow, right? You see the root. Then you have cry at all. There is no at all. It's cry. And then you have surely here. There is no surely. You will hear here. Okay, you see this? You see the root of these words. Okay, so this is a dire warning. All these scriptures are connected. From the Story of God commentary, although the emphasis in this part of Exodus is strongly on Israel as the sinned against victims of horrendous injustice, they were far from being sinlessly innocent themselves. From Exodus 16 onwards, they will be portrayed as incorrigibly stubborn and rebellious. Through the long centuries of their history in the land, they would prove the point again and again until God would bring on them a measure of judgment that, in the portrait of Lamentations, would far exceed even that which he brought on the Egyptians. This is how serious all of this is. The final plague, better blow, was actually the first one to be foretold to Moshe. Exodus 4:22-23. And you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. And I say to you, let my son go, which he didn't say, that he may serve me. And if you refuse to let him go, behold, I will surely slay your son, your firstborn. So pharaohs were considered divine, as we've learned at the very beginning. So that would be my firstborn son for your firstborn son. I am the real God, and Israel is my firstborn son. You claim to be a God, and your firstborn son. So my son for your son. Some commentators even believe that the death of the firstborn was actually the only plague God struck the Egyptians with, and the other 9 were added much later to embellish the story. So some more background info. The death of the firstborn in the Exodus narrative reveals the central role of divine lineage in Egyptian royal ideology, where the firstborn son of Pharaoh was not merely a political heir, but a future deity, embodying the continuation of cosmic order, which is Ma'at, and divine kingship. In Egyptian belief, the pharaoh was the living incarnation of Horus, Osiris, or other. There is a merger in different stories. Horus, the son of Osiris, and Isis, and upon death, he became Osiris, with his first son ascending as the new Horus. The divine succession legitimized the king's absolute authority and his role as intermediary between gods and humans. The firstborn heir was thus sacrosanct. He was holy. He was set apart, believed to carry divine essence and destined for godhood. Ra, the sun god and supreme deity, was seen as the creator and life giver. The plague of darkness already challenged Ra's dominion by plunging Egypt into impenetrable darkness for 3 days, while the Israelites remained in the light. Now the 10th plague completed this symbolic defeat. By killing the firstborn, including Pharaoh's son, the divine heir, God demonstrated that even the most sacred line of divine kingship in Egypt was subject to his judgment. These plagues, or these divine strokes or blows, were theological acts meant to show the supremacy of the God of Israel over the gods of Israel. And again, Exodus 12:12 said, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am Yahweh. And the last blow made it abundantly clear that there is only one creator who holds the power over life, death, and resurrection. And his name is Yahweh. The consecration of the firstborn. Exodus 13, verse 2. Sanctify to me all of the firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of men and of animal, it is mine. And Exodus 13, verse 14 through 16. So it shall be when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is this? That you shall say to him, by strength of hand, here again, Yahweh brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, and it came to pass when Pharaoh was stubborn about letting us go, that Yahweh killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. Therefore, I sacrifice to Yahweh all males that open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. So the consecration of the firstborn son is to be a constant reminder of the Exodus, God's great deliverance of his people, which was achieved at the cost of the death of all the firstborn, man and beast of Egypt. This act of consecration signifies that all life, especially the first and best, belongs to God as a result of his saving power during the Exodus. The command directly follows the Passover event, where God spared the firstborn of the houses that were covered by the blood of the lamb or goat, while striking down the firstborn of Egypt. It serves as a perpetual reminder of God's mighty deliverance and covenant relationship with Israel. The firstborn represented the whole family and the future of the lineage. Dedicating them to God acknowledged his sovereignty over all life. Next, plundering the Egyptians. I was surprised that I couldn't get a good image. Couldn't find one. somewhere shown like carrying like boxes of gold like this. Said, yeah, right. Okay. Exodus 12, 35 and 36. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moshe, and they had asked from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And Yahweh had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Plundering the Egyptians has become a catchphrase, usually interpreted as compensation for the slave labor or just the cherry on top of the redemption pie. Of course, one can interpret it like that, but that is very, very superficial. But then again, is this interpretation really biblically correct? Or is there more? Is there more to it? And the answer is yes. Good. Good. So we have to look at this, the whole Exodus thing. We have to look at this from a covenant perspective. Okay, that is important. That was the last piece of the covenant. Plundering the Egyptians was not optional. It was not the cherry on top. Why? Leaving Egypt with great wealth was an integral part of God's covenant promise to Abram in the covenant of the pieces in Genesis 15, verses 13 and 14. Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years, and also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterwards, that's the point now, afterward, they shall come out with great possessions. It was reaffirmed to happen during Moshe's calling at the burning bush in Exodus 3:22. So you shall plunder the Egyptians. And then it actually happened after the death of the firstborn in Exodus 12:36. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. And here, something else, before I forget it. We talked about how many of them, the percentage of who changed sides, did what the Egyptians did, served their gods. And there are indications, there are some of the scriptures that we just need to pay attention to. They were told to ask from their neighbors articles of gold and silver and stuff. That means they were living right next to Egyptians. So they were not separate. So, and then hundreds of years, however many years that was, so you may have had good neighbors. Okay? Whatever that entails. So just keep these things in mind, okay? So they were not separate. That's the point. So this again is proof that Yahweh's word can be trusted, and that he is well able to fulfill at his appointed time what he had promised centuries, even millennia before. And this is our only hope for the future. Why was the wealth of Egypt needed and not just the cherry on top? Why were these things needed, and what were they needed for? For the tabernacle, of course. The gold and the silver and all the other materials became the Egyptian contribution to the tabernacle. We talk more about that later. So plundering the Egyptians is the actual fulfillment of a covenant promise and a necessary component for the establishment of God's dwelling place to accommodate his presence among his people. Then I have another cultural nugget from the New King James Cultural Background Study Bible. Exodus 12:36, thus they plundered the Egyptians. The silver and gold items taken were some of the most valuable of the Egyptians' possessions. Moreover, these events took place in the spring, when it was customary for Egyptian kings, particularly those of the New Kingdom, which is roughly between 1500 and 1000. So that covers the time where the Exodus is supposed to be, to send out messengers and accompanying armies in order to collect tribute. It's tax time. To collect tribute payments from the smaller political entities, i.e., the city-states outside of Egypt, who were their vassals. In a sense, then, springtime was the time Egyptians officially plundered their subjects, peoples. Okay? Tax time. So there are things that just don't change, right? Apparently. So now a greater king, the King of Kings, was coming to collect his dues. And also, what we need to remember here, the Israelites got the stuff, but it was not theirs. Okay, this is important. Once again, the biblical text turns the tables on an Egyptian custom. This time, the Egyptians are the ones exploited and forced to pay. And once again, there was nothing Pharaoh could do to prevent the Hebrew slaves from plundering the Egyptians, the subjects of his kingdom, and give freely the gold and silver needed for the building of Yahweh's tabernacle. End quote. But then there is a greater, a cosmic reality to this, however. Haggai 2, verse 8. God says, the silver is mine and the gold is mine, says Yahweh Tzevaot, meaning it's not the Egyptians to begin with. Okay. Next, the bones of Joseph. Genesis 50:21. That's the beginning of Beshalach. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you. This is visit. It's double again. God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. Now the time has come for this oath to be fulfilled. Exodus 13, verse 19. And Moshe took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. He had put them under solemn oath. What does that mean? That is important. When you swear an oath, what do? You invoke the name of Yahweh. So this is not to be taken lightly. Okay? And then we have Joshua 24:32. It's the next time they are mentioned. The bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought up out of Egypt, they buried at Shechem in the plot of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, which had become an inheritance of the children of Joseph. The last mention of the bones of Joseph is in Hebrews 11, the Faith Hall of Fame. Joseph could have been remembered forever for many, many great things, not at least for saving the world from starvation. He was the savior of the world at the time, after suffering innocently in prison for over a decade, not losing faith that his God was with him. Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph the Righteous One, was a man of great character who lived an extraordinarily faithful life during times of extraordinary hardship. Plus, as the son-in-law of the priest of On of Heliopolis, the center of the great Ennead worship, he lived for many decades in the spiritual center of pagan worship. Many actions of integrity could be cited as examples of his solid faith in God that would earn him a place in the Faith Hall of Fame. But this is not what Joseph is to be remembered for. And if you do not have any background, you do not understand what it even means. Hebrews 11:22. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure, and the word is Exodus, of the children of Israel, and gave instructions concerning his bones. So what does that mean? Why, among all the other meritorious feats of Joseph's life, are the instructions about his bones singled out as his ideal act of faith? Why is that important? As I mentioned at the very beginning, during the time of Joseph, Goshen was too good to leave. By the time of Joseph's death, the Israelites had become so attached to land, they had acquired possessions, etc., that leaving Egypt was not on their radar. There was no reason to leave Egypt. By making them swear an oath and invoking Yahweh's name to not leave his bones in the land of Egypt, Joseph made sure that Egypt would not remain their home, that they would not consider the land of Egypt their destiny, but the land promised to Abram in a covenant by God, the land of Canaan, would be their final destination. The oath would guarantee that. Of course, they could have disregarded it, right? But they wouldn't. On a spiritual level, Joseph expressed hope beyond the grave, a belief in life after life. And in Hebrew, life is chayim, it's plural. This is also important. Oh my goodness. So a belief in life after life, in the resurrection of the dead, in Tchiyat Hametim, at the end of days, when we will all hopefully wake up from a bad dream to real life. We found this alluded to in Genesis 45:5. God sent me before you to preserve life, and that is the verb mechia, from which we get Tchiyat Hametim, the resurrection of the dead, which is not a biblical word, but is an expression used for this. Life after life. Why is the Hebrew word in the plural? It expresses the belief that there is a continuation of life, a transition from this life, this nightmare, to the next. That death is not the end, but the beginning of life, whatever that may look like. And of course, people have very, very many different beliefs. Joseph's bones are buried in Shechem. Shechem is where the land promise was made to Abram in Genesis 12, verse 6. Jacob purchased a plot of land there. Jacob's well is there, and Joseph's tomb is there to this day. During the not-so-glorious history of the sons of Jacob, Shechem in Samaria, in the hill country of Ephraim, the territory of Joseph, became the first capital of the kingdom of Israel after the split from Judah. To the fields near Shechem, Jacob sent Joseph to look after the well-being of his brothers. From here, Joseph was exiled, and to this place he returned. Here, Joseph's exile began, and here it ended. So here we have the first closed Joseph cycle, beginning and end. And prophetically, of course, we're waiting for the closing of the last of the big cycle and the final redemption. In John 4, Yeshua met the Samaritan woman at the well, a pagan in the eyes of the Jews, and to her here at Jacob's well, he revealed himself as the promised Messiah, the son of Joseph. From First Fruits of Zion. As the children of Israel left Egypt, after that first Passover, they left Joseph's empty tomb behind them in Egypt. Joseph's empty tomb represented Israel's redemption from Egypt. For Joseph had prophesied that God would bring them up from there, and he made them promise to bring his bones with them. The empty tomb signified that the promised redemption had occurred. Joseph's empty tomb portends Messiah's empty tomb. On a Passover 1400 years after Moshe took Joseph's remains from his tomb, our Master Yeshua left behind an empty tomb as well. And in fact, the tomb belonged to a man named Joseph. And it's all just coincidence. Okay. So now we're just doing an intro to Beshalach. Today is a special Shabbat, yet without special readings because the reading itself is considered special. Parashat Beshalach. This is when the God of Israel parts the Red Sea and leads the Israelites through the midst of the sea on dry ground. This is extremely important. We are not going to talk about this today, but next week. That's why we're not leaving Egypt yet. Okay. That is when they finally left Egypt proper and started their journey, albeit with murmuring and complaining, through the wilderness to Mount Sinai, Yahweh performing daily miracles to sustain them. It is also called Shabbat Shirah, the Shabbat of Song, which is Exodus 15, so called after the song of praise Moshe and the Israelites sang after they had crossed the Red Sea on dry ground and saw their enemy defeated. The song is also called Shabbat Hayam, or not Shabbat, Shirat Hayam, the song of the sea. This is when the nation was born. And here I want to point out a very important connection to Psalm 136. Next. There is something interesting here. The psalm begins with thanksgiving to Yahweh for his enduring mercy, and then jumps from creation immediately to the Exodus, the creation of the nation of Israel. So creation is a big theme in the book of Exodus. Psalm 136 verses 7 through 15. To him who made great lights, for his mercy endures forever, the sun to rule by day, for his mercy endures forever, the moon and stars to rule by night, for his mercy endures forever, to him who struck Egypt. Okay, so we just had the creation of the sun, the moon, the stars, and now we have Egypt. To him who struck Egypt in their firstborn. Oh my goodness. Who struck Egypt in their firstborn, for his mercy endures forever, and brought Israel out from among them, for his mercy endures forever, with a strong hand, here it is again, and with an outstretched arm, for his mercy endures forever, to him who divided the Red Sea in two, for his mercy endures forever, and made Israel pass through the midst of it, for his mercy endures forever, but overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea, for his mercy endures forever. Okay. So what is interesting here is verse 13, to him who divided the Red Sea in two. And the King James has in two parts. This is an interesting verse because it uses the word gezer for parts, which is the word used in Genesis 15:17 for the parts of the covenant pieces, the animals, walking between the pieces or the parts. Okay. So why is it important? Because this word occurs only 2 times in all of Scripture in these 2 scriptures. So this cannot be a coincidence, but has to be intentional to make a covenant connection to the crossing of the Red Sea as a fulfillment of the first part of the covenant made with Abraham to bring his descendants out from the land that is not theirs and with great possessions. Then I want to point something out, just one verse from the Song of the Sea, because we're not going to cover this. We're going to talk about some of that next week. That's Exodus 15, verse 6. Your right hand, O Yahweh, has become glorious in power. Your right hand, O Yahweh, has dashed the enemy in pieces. This is an important thing. Again, from the New King James Cultural Background Study Bible. Significantly, the drowning of the Egyptian army is celebrated in terms of smashing and shattering. This statement is reminiscent of how a particular set of Egyptian inscriptions, known as execration texts, was used. And we're going to watch a very short clip. The inscriptions were incised on stone, wood, and clay objects, which were often shaped to represent a foreign ruler. Many have been found on pottery bowls as well. The objects and their accompanying inscriptions apparently played an important role in Egyptian curse rituals. Though it is not clear that all such rituals involved the use of objects like these, there is evidence that formal cursing of enemies was practiced in Egypt throughout much of the 2nd and 3rd millennia BC. Most of the objects bearing inscriptions, however, seem to date to a more narrow period of time, generally the first half of the 2nd millennium. This is our Exodus time. The inscriptions themselves contain the names of various local rulers in Syria and Palestine, and often conclude with a summary reference to anyone, quote, who may rebel, who may plot, who may fight, who may talk of fighting, or who may talk of rebelling, end quote. A curse formula was then pronounced over the object, and the object was smashed to depict the fulfillment of the curse and the hoped-for destruction of the targeted enemy. The wording of this verse in Exodus may be alluding to this type of symbolic action. Symbolic action, okay? Yahweh did not throw and smash a bowl or something, right? But what he does, and we come back to this, he uses the imagery, the symbolism, the things they did in rituals, and he demystifies these things because he doesn't do anything. Okay? Just like Moshe didn't do anything to split the sea, he just lifted up the rod. No words, nothing. Okay? Although the narrative speaks of drowning, the song describes the destruction of Yahweh's enemies in terms that would have offended ancient Egyptian sensibilities, since it reverses the roles and presents Egypt as the shattered enemy. Okay? And now we're going to watch the short clip. We've seen this before.
Jerusalem is also mentioned in some other texts. For instance, this text, right? Before there were iPads, you wrote on your clay figurines, okay? Now what this is an execration text, and these things are fun. Not exactly a voodoo doll, but kinda. And what you do with an execration text is with these kinds of texts. They're texts that usually are buried with people. We found these about 1900 BC. I say we like I was part of the expedition. Scholars found these about I'm not that old. About 1900 BCE. They were written in hieroglyphic on clay figurines, and these were discovered in Saqqara, Egypt. And what you did was you wrote the names of your enemies on it, and then you smashed them. This is how it worked. And it's kind of this idea of sympathetic magic, right? How do you curse your enemy, right? Do you just call them names? I mean, you can punch them in the face. But what's even better is to call upon the gods and put the curse on someone. So what you do is you write their name on something, and then you break it. Remember how we talked about we came to a point in Jewish history where you wouldn't even write the name of God? Why? Because you might erase the name of God, and erasing someone's name or ripping up a document with someone's name on it has magical elements in a lot of ancient religions, including ancient Egypt. So what you would do is, so if we hate USC, right, UCLA, we hate, you can't spell suck without USC, this kind of thing. So we would write USC on a doll, and then we'd smash it. And that's how you curse USC. So maybe next year we'll beat them in football, right? Because we wrote them on that and basketball and all the other sports. Okay, so that's how it would work. One of these figurines that we found in Egypt, not we, but scholars found in Egypt, Rusa Limum, which is basically a reference to Jerusalem. So basically, someone in Saqqara, Egypt was cursing Jerusalem, one of Egypt's enemies. But what it means for us archaeologists is that we've got a literary reference to the town of Jerusalem going back to about 1900 BCE. So not only was there settlement in Jerusalem, but now you've got, and this is not biblical, obviously, this is extra biblical evidence, hard evidence, that shows that not only was Jerusalem, did it have people living there, but it was at least worthy enough, big enough to be worthy of a curse text for someone to curse it. And it also mentions the name of some of the rulers. So obviously Jerusalem had a ruling class locally. So the Egyptian execration texts give us non-biblical evidence of Jerusalem as a city prior to Israelite occupation.
So you know what it is about. Okay. Next, Baal Zephon. The Baal Zephon plan, Egypt's final lesson. After the children of Israel journeyed for a few days, God commanded Moshe to turn them back, to tell them to backtrack slightly and camp in a very specific location for a very specific reason. Exodus 14, 1 through 4. Now Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi Hahirot, between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea, for Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are bewildered or imprisoned by the land. The wilderness has closed them in. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them. And I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am Yahweh. And they did. So, problem. Where is Pi Hahirot, Migdol, Baal Zephon? Neither Pi Hahirot nor any other place mentioned with it can be exactly located. So, we don't know. They did. Okay. First, I decided not to show a map, but I'm going to show you a map. Because just like with time, this happened. Go back to the map, please. This happened whenever. So, and they say, okay, that's exact. And some people put things on a map and say, that's there, without a question mark, okay? So, basically, there are three major opinions. Because we don't know where it is. We always have to remind ourselves of that. Okay. And a lot depends on where you put Mount Sinai. Okay? So, this is the one that I believe is the more correct version, where you have Mount Sinai in Arabia, in Midian, right? So, and that would be the route. They would go to Nueva and then over, and Midian and Mount Sinai would be here. Okay? The traditional one, and then Pihai and all these places would be somewhere here in this area. Okay? Because it happened before the crossing. So that would have to be here if that is correct. Most have Mount Sinai here. Right? There is the monastery there. Okay. So then the route is totally different, and some then have Baal Zephon here on the island. Others, there is the northern version, and this to you is probably, I think you don't know or haven't heard that one. There is a northern version. So then Mount Sinai would be in the north. Okay? And then all these places have to be here, and the crossing would have happened somewhere here through one of those lakes. Have you heard about that version? Yeah? So these are basically three, and all depends on where you put Mount Sinai. But it is Baal Zephon. So maybe it is not so important to us where it is, but the Baal part is important. So let's look at this more conceptually than literally. Put more emphasis on what is the concept. Why is this mentioned? Instead of trying to figure out where is it, which doesn't really, well, not that it doesn't make any difference. I don't want to say that. But what it means is more important than where it is. Let's put it that way. Okay, does it make sense? Okay. Okay, so this is from Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, and he is from a contributor to Israel 365. And I found this a couple of years ago, and I presented this to you before. But this is important. It is interesting that at the end of the passage, God told Moshe that as a result of this plan, Egypt will finally know that he is God. No, that's not what it is. They will know that he is Yahweh, not God. Okay? But of course, they can't say this. Apparently, the 10 plagues, including the final death of the firstborn, had failed to convince the Egyptians of the supremacy of the God of Israel. What are the details of this plan? Let's sum up the content of these verses. First, the children of Israel to travel back toward Egypt and camp opposite Baal Zephon. Upon hearing about this, Pharaoh will conclude that they are imprisoned, and the verb is nevuchim, which is a rare word, I guess. In the land, they are imprisoned in the land and locked in by the desert. Emboldened by this conclusion, Pharaoh and his army will pursue the children of Israel and fall right into the trap that God has set for them. They will then learn once and for all that the Lord is God. Why there? What is the purpose of the plan? The location where God wants Israel to camp is very specific. The Bible does not generally give us such detailed descriptions of locations. Yet here we have very precise coordinates. Before Pihahirot, between Migdal and the sea, before Baal Zephon, you shall camp opposite it by the sea. Once the specific location at which Israel is to encamp before Pihahirot, between Migdal and the sea, is stated, the additional detail before Baal Zephon seems superfluous. Haven't the directions been stated clearly enough? What is the importance of Baal Zephon? That is the key. According to the plan, it seems the encampment of Israel at Baal Zephon specifically will cause Pharaoh to conclude that Israel is doomed. What is it about Baal Zephon that leads Pharaoh to believe that the God who decimated Egypt with the 10 plagues will not be able to save Israel from being imprisoned and locked in? When God told Moshe how Pharaoh will react to the news, he suggested that Pharaoh will say, they are imprisoned, nebuchim, in the land and locked in by the desert. What exactly do these phrases mean? Imprisoned in the land, locked in by the desert. Why not simply say that Israel is lost or stranded? Why does God suggest that this is what Pharaoh will say? Furthermore, is there a connection between these unusual phrases and Baal Zephon? Finally, God said that at the end of this plan, the Egyptians will finally know, quote, know that I am God. Know that I am Yahweh. Do you see the difference between that? Yeah. Okay. The question is obvious. If the 10 plagues, and especially the plagues of the firstborn, the plague of the firstborn, didn't teach the Egyptians to believe in God, in Yahweh, do we suppose that this plan will? Jewish tradition teaches, here again, tradition, okay, teaches that the 10 plagues successfully destroyed all the false gods of Egypt except for one, Baal Zephon. That's Rashi, okay? Tradition. Why? What is it about Baal Zephon that left it unchallenged by all the miraculous signs and wonders that God had done in Egypt? Who is Baal Zephon? What is the meaning of the name Baal Zephon? From the prefix Baal, we know that we are dealing with a pagan god. Biblical text is replete with references to various Baals or pagan gods. We have Baal Zebub, Baal Peor, Baalim, the plural of Baal, are but a few examples. The Hebrew word Baal literally means what? Master, Lord, owner. Zephon or Tzafon is the Hebrew word for north. That you need to know. Zephon is important. A precise translation of Baal Zephon is master of the north, or north lord, or Baal of the north. Remarkably, the Book of the Dead, an ancient Egyptian religious text, mentions a prominent god known as Lord of the Northern Sky, an almost perfect translation of the Hebrew Baal Zephon. This god's Egyptian name was Set. He was the patron deity of northern Egypt and was believed to be responsible for fierce desert storms. According to ancient Egyptian mythology, Set murdered his brother Osiris. Remember this from last time? Set murdered his brother Osiris and attempted to kill his nephew Horus. For this, Set was cast out into the lonely desert for eternity. In the 19th dynasty, the period of Israel's enslavement, there was a resurgence of reverence for Set. He was seen as a great god, the god who benevolently restrained the forces of the desert and protected Egypt from foreigners. Desert storms, the sea, and preventing escape. Set personified the powers of darkness, chaos, and the sea waters that resisted light and order. Order? The prominent 19th century Egyptologist Dr. Heinrich Bursch, that sounds German, asserted that from the standpoint of an Egyptian in Upper Egypt, the north was rightly considered to be the place of darkness, cold, mist, and rain, all of which were attributes of Set, and that the Hebrews called the region of darkness or the winter hemisphere Tzafon, a name which appears to be connected beyond a doubt with Tzafon, north. As for Jewish sources, Rabbi Abram ben Ezra, 11th century, writes that Baal Zephon was believed to have the power to prevent slaves from escaping Egypt. Remember, this is 11th century, okay? In light of the above, the tradition that Baal-zephon was the only remaining Egyptian god makes sense. Baal-zephon's dominion was not in Egypt, but out in the desert. The 10 plagues took place in Egypt itself. Understanding the plan. Let's review the plan. Speak to the children of Israel and let them turn back and encamp before Pi-Hahirot, between Migdol and the sea, before Baal-zephon. You shall camp opposite it by the sea. God specifically told Israel to encamp opposite Baal-zephon by the sea. Recall that Baal-zephon was believed to control the water. Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are imprisoned in the land. The desert has locked them in. Hearing that Israel was stopped at Baal-zephon, Pharaoh would conclude that Baal-zephon had trapped them. The odd word choice, they are imprisoned in the land, the desert has locked them in, can now be explained. The Hebrew word nevuchim is not usually translated as imprisoned. The actual translation of the word is perplexed, depressed, or confused. If Pharaoh believed that Israel had fallen into the clutches of Baal-zephon, the god responsible for chaos, darkness, and desert storms, describing Israel as imprisoned would be an accurate way of saying Baal-zephon has got them. The second phrase in Pharaoh's suggested reaction is the desert has locked them in. But an equally precise translation would be he has locked the desert upon them. In other words, Pharaoh believed that Baal-zephon had trapped the children of Israel in the desert. Summing up the plan, God led Pharaoh to believe that Baal-zephon had successfully defied the God of Israel. Emboldened by this conclusion, Pharaoh will rush out to defeat Israel in the presence of Baal-zephon, over whom the God of Israel apparently had no power. Thus, the stage was set for the refutation of the final god of Egypt, and with it, all of Egyptian paganism. With the escaping slave camped right in front of Baal-zephon, the Egyptian god of the storms, chaos, water was refuted by a storm so orderly that it neatly split the water, miraculously forming 2 walls. Storms, chaos, and water were all clearly shown to be fully under God's control. The splitting of the Red Sea is the greatest miracle of the Exodus story, not because it was a greater deviation from the laws of nature than, for example, the plague of blood. The splitting of the sea is the greatest miracle, the cause of the great song of praise that Israel sings to God, because through it, Egypt and Israel knew finally and without a shadow of a doubt that, quote, I am God. No, I am Yahweh. So there is much more to Tzafon than that. Baal-zephon, what is important to remember, I mentioned at the beginning, during all this time in Egypt, during the plagues, all of that, not one time is there mention of any Egyptian god. But now, here, we have the mention of Baal. Now that they are leaving Egypt behind, Baal-zephon, the Lord of the North, becomes God's and the Israelites' lethal enemy. Okay? So there is a lot to the concept of north, and we are going to talk about that too later. So now, do we still have time for the video? Yeah? Okay. Now we're going to watch a video that is not directly connected to this, but I think it is very, very, very important concerning how we look at archaeology, how we interpret when we see something written, and how we interpret the time frame of things. Because I keep saying nobody knows what time it really is, right? And this is so true. And I came across this, and I think everybody should know this. And this is why I want to play it here so that everybody who watches this video sees this too, to make sure that they watch it, okay? And I say Amen and Amen.
The official story is neat. Writing appears, civilization emerges, history begins. But neat stories are usually wrong. And recent evidence shows that writing may be far older than we thought. So here's the uncomfortable question. Why wouldn't early humans have written language? And if they did, what does that mean for how we view prehistory? Hi guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Michael. I have a degree in ancient history, and on this channel, we discuss the unexplainable mysteries of our past. Let's get into it. Writing is not just communication, it is external memory. It allows ideas to exist outside the human mind and survive long after the person who created them is gone. Before writing, knowledge had a built-in expiration date. It had to be memorized, repeated constantly, passed down orally, generation after generation. When people died, knowledge was always at risk of dying with them. But writing changes that relationship entirely. It allows information to accumulate rather than reset. Laws can persist, calendars can be standardized, rituals can remain consistent across centuries. That is why historians treat writing as the dividing line between prehistory and history. Prehistory is the time before written records. For example, we call Ice Age societies prehistoric not because they lacked culture or intelligence, but because they left no surviving written texts. History begins when writing appears. But notice the quiet implication hiding inside that definition. If writing existed but didn't survive, then we would still call that period prehistory. Not because nothing happened, but because nothing lasted. And that brings us to the critical question. How exactly do we decide when writing first appears? Officially, writing began around 3200 BC, based on clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia. These tablets survive because clay, once fired, is extremely durable. It does not rot, it does not dissolve easily, it doesn't really care about time. But this creates an assumption that often goes unnoticed, that writing began on materials designed to last thousands of years. However, history tells us that is almost certainly false. Most writing throughout history was temporary, practical, and disposable. Notes, lists, tallies, reminders. You don't engrave your grocery list into stone. You scribble it onto something cheap, light, and replaceable. And ancient people did the same. They used wood, wax, leather, bark, and plant fibers, materials that archaeology almost never recovers. So when historians say this is the earliest writing, what they are really saying is this is the earliest writing that didn't decay. And once you realize that, you're forced to ask a much bigger question. What happens to this timeline when we look at societies that were complex, long before durable writing appeared? To explore this problem properly, we need to look at a site that genuinely rewrote the archaeological rulebook, Göbekli Tepe. It dates to around 9600 BC, long before farming, cities, or writing. And yet, what we find there is astonishing. Göbekli Tepe contains massive stone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, arranged in carefully planned circular enclosures. This was not accidental construction. It required organization, coordination, and long-term planning on a large scale. You don't quarry, transport, carve, and erect stones like this without shared knowledge and structured communication. And that's where Göbekli Tepe becomes especially interesting, because carved into these pillars are repeated symbols and motifs. Animals, abstract markings, consistent imagery appearing across multiple structures. That repetition matters, because repetition suggests intention, and intention suggests meaning. Assyriologist Irving Finkel has argued that when you look closely at the imagery from Göbekli Tepe, you begin to see something that looks less like decoration and more like a symbolic system. In a conversation with Lex Friedman, Finkel points out a lesser-known artifact from the site, a small, rounded, green stone. It has an arched back and a flat underside, similar in shape to later stamp seals from Egypt and Mesopotamia, and carved into its flat surface are what appear to be hieroglyphic-style signs. Finkel argues that this object was likely a seal designed to be pressed into clay or another soft material to leave an impression. In other words, a tool used for ratification, for marking ownership, for approving transactions, for formalizing agreements. And according to the dating of the site, this object belongs to around 9000 BC.
Now, it's important to be very clear here. This interpretation is controversial, it's not the mainstream position. But Finkel's reasoning is not just casual speculation.
He argues that seals of this kind are not decorative objects. They are functional. They exist to leave repeated impressions, and repeated impressions imply a shared system of meaning. In Finkel's words, this seal is not just a squiggle on a pot. It is a finished object made for a specific bureaucratic purpose. And if that interpretation is correct, it would suggest a form of pictographic writing thousands of years earlier than traditionally accepted. But Finkel also raises a broader point. When he was a student, he was taught that writing emerged in Mesopotamia because cities became too complex to manage without it. Large populations, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade created problems of organization. The traditional argument is that writing was invented in Mesopotamia as a practical solution to manage that growing complexity. But then Göbekli Tepe thus presents a problem. Because if that level of organization required writing in Sumer around 3000 BC, how was it achieved at Göbekli Tepe 7,000 years earlier? You don't organize a workforce of this scale with a megaphone and good intentions. The finish of the architecture is too precise, the planning is deliberate, the vision is coherent. Someone was coordinating this effort.
Now again, to be clear, this does not prove that full writing existed at Göbekli Tepe, but it strongly suggests that symbolic systems capable of recording and communicating information were already in use. And remember, only 10% of this site has been excavated, so what else could be hiding beneath the ground?
Imagine if an equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, the one artifact that allowed us to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs, lay hidden in the unexcavated 90% of Göbekli Tepe. This thus leads to a natural next question. If early humans were using seals, symbols, or notation systems at this level, then what were they actually writing on? Because to answer that, we need to talk about the physical reality of writing itself.
This is where the timeline really begins to unravel, because historically, writing does not survive by default, it survives by accident. And to see why, we need to look at what writing was actually made from.
In Mesopotamia, where the earliest surviving writing appears around 3100 BC, clay was everywhere. The river plains of the Tigris and Euphrates were full of it, so scribes used what they had. They took damp clay and pressed marks into it with cut reeds, forming wedge-shaped impressions. This is where cuneiform comes from. Once dried in the sun, these tablets became extremely durable, almost indestructible in fact, which is why they survive in such large numbers even today, thousands of years later. But there's an important catch. Clay tablets are terrible for everyday communication. They're heavy, they're very fragile before they dry, and they're not exactly ideal for sending messages. So clay survives not because it was the best writing material, but only because it happened to fossilize well. Almost at the same time, around 3000 BC, the Egyptians solved a very different problem. They needed writing that could travel, so they invented papyrus, a smooth, flexible surface made from strips of a Nile plant, pressed and dried into sheets. Papyrus could be rolled into scrolls, it could be carried, it could be copied, and for over 3,500 years, almost every book in Egypt, Greece, and Rome was written on it.
In other words, the ancient world almost overwhelmingly relied on a material that doesn't survive outside of dry deserts. That alone should make us nervous about how complete our record really is.
Elsewhere, people used what worked locally. In China, bamboo strips were tied together with thread to form books. Records tell us that they were used as early as 1500 BC, even though the earliest surviving examples are much later. In India, palm leaves were used for manuscripts. Early Buddhist texts were written on birch bark. Romans, when cut off from papyrus supplies in Britain, wrote letters on thin wooden tablets. Some of these have actually survived near Hadrian's Wall, including something wonderfully human, a birthday invitation. Now, just imagine how much writing didn't survive. Wax tablets were used everywhere from Greece to Rome. They were reusable notebooks. You wrote on them, warmed the wax, and smoothed them flat again. They were designed to vanish, and they did. Later still, parchment appeared, more durable but expensive, used mainly for important texts. But even parchment only became common centuries after writing itself, and then much later, paper appeared in China around AD 105. It slowly spread westward, and it doesn't reach Europe in force until the medieval period, and even then, many early papers degrade rapidly. Books from as recent as the 19th century are already crumbling.
So here's the uncomfortable truth. For most of human history, writing was done on materials that decay, which means the writing we have is not typical. It's exceptional.
It survived because conditions were perfect, or because disaster accidentally preserved it. Now picture prehistoric writing, not carved in stone but scratched into bark or written. That would go beyond what the data supports, but the evidence does allow a careful conclusion. The earliest surviving writing is not necessarily the first writing. That writing likely began as a fragile technology, and that it may have emerged, disappeared, and re-emerged multiple times. Think of it like early fire use. The first fires left no permanent trace. Only later do hearths appear in the archaeological record. Writing may follow the same pattern, invisible at first until it finally leaves a mark that time cannot erase. And if that's true, we should expect to see earlier precursors to writing, which brings us much further back in time.
Now we need to step much deeper into prehistory, far beyond Göbekli Tepe, all the way back to Upper Paleolithic Europe, between 30 and 40,000 years ago.
This was the Deep Ice Age. Glaciers covered much of the continent, and yet humans were leaving marks that still speak to us today. Across cave sites throughout Europe, archaeologists have found symbols. Not animals, not hunting scenes, not decorative flourishes, but symbols. If you've ever seen images from caves like Lascaux or Altamira, you know how powerful the animal paintings are. Horses in motion, bisons mid-charge, bulls, bears and deer rendered with incredible skill. But as anthropologist Genevieve von Petzinger points out, those animals may have distracted us from something even more important. Hidden among them are small geometric designs. Dots, lines, triangles, crosses, discs. They're easy to overlook, and for decades they mostly were. But von Petzinger became fascinated by these markings precisely because of how strange they are. Millennia ago, someone went to the effort of carving or painting these symbols onto cave walls, in dark, hard-to-reach places.
That alone raises a question. Why were they important enough to do that?
To find out, von Petzinger and her photographer husband systematically recorded these symbols. They visited 52 cave sites across Europe, and what they found was remarkable. At 75% of the caves, they documented symbols that had never been recorded before. Even more striking, the symbols far outnumbered the animal and human figures. But the most astonishing discovery came later. No matter how many caves they visited, they kept finding the same small set of symbols, over and over again. After analysing the data, von Petzinger identified just 32 recurring shapes, and these symbols appear across an entire continent, over a time span of 30,000 years. That level of consistency can't be random. It strongly suggests shared meaning. As von Petzinger explains, quote, "If they weren't meaningful, people wouldn't keep replicating them."
Now, it's important to be clear about what these symbols are not. They are not a fully written language. There are not enough signs to represent spoken words. They don't repeat in the same way that alphabets or syllabaries do. But that doesn't mean they were meaningless. Von Petzinger argues that these markings function more like notation, a way of storing information, encoding ideas visually so they could be understood later by others. That is a huge shift, because this is the earliest evidence that communication wasn't limited to speech or gesture. It had become graphic, permanent, external. Now, what the symbols mean exactly is still unknown. Some may represent objects, tools, or plants. Others could be clan signs. In some cases, there may be counting, tallying, or early mapping involved. The meanings are lost, but the system is not. Even more intriguing, von Petzinger found that 2/3 of these symbols were already in use when Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. This suggests they were not invented locally. They may have been part of a much older tradition, possibly brought from Africa. In other words, symbolic communication may be far older than the European cave art itself. Now, von Petzinger does not claim these symbols are writing, but she is very clear about their significance. They show that humans were encoding and transmitting information symbolically tens of thousands of years earlier than traditionally assumed. And remember, these were found in caves, the most likely place for them to survive. So think of all the written communication from outside that has since been lost. Once you see that, a final, uncomfortable question emerges. If humans were already capable of storing symbolic information this early, how much of that symbolic world has vanished completely? And if so much was lost even here, then what chance did fragile early writing really have to survive? Which brings us to the final reckoning. What all of this suggests is not that ancient humans were mysterious geniuses. It suggests that they were practical. They used materials that worked, and those materials didn't last. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is often merely evidence of decay. The real mystery is not whether early writing existed. The real mystery is whether it had any chance of surviving long enough for us to see it. And that perhaps is the most important lesson archaeology is trying to teach us. Humans have been intelligent and writing for much longer than we thought. And this key signifier for civilization might go back far deeper into time than we ever imagined. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, a comment, or